more nuanced conversations. And I think when you don't have that support from a systematic level, it becomes that you're the only one in your newsroom and it's overwhelming. And then you start thinking about, well, I need to cover everything because if I don't do it, who else is going to do it? And you're just like, can you really cover a region, a population that is in the billions? Of course not. But that doesn't mean you're not going to go to sleep at night thinking like, well, I have to, right? Somebody has to. And I think this has only become amplified after October 7th, which is if I take a break because I'm having a mental breakdown because of the secondhand trauma, then these stories won't get written. So I think there needs to be more of a symbiosis in terms of the conversation between the readers and the editors and the journalists. Because otherwise, we go back to the pre-9/11 era where CNN was asking to interview the imam down the street who barely spoke English, chopped up his soundbite, threw up on the television, and now his congregation is mad at me because you made us look worse. And I think that's changed in the era of social media. Because now you have people coming back and being like, this is a terrible headline and it's inaccurate, and so like we're all going to say this, right? You have people who are posting videos who are saying, this is not the full quote that I've given, and I'm going to now reclaim my narrative to what I actually told that journalist. People are now smarter and saying, I can do this interview because I have the capabilities of doing it, or no, I'm going to send you to someone who can. And I think that's what beautiful media literacy looks like in our community. Because if we think like we just got maybe one or two good Muslim or Arab journalists doing this work, then our bar is way too low. It's a qualitative numbers game. It's not a competition. I would love to have more folks sitting in my desk next to me. I would love to have more people who are not even Arab and Muslim to cover these issues. Because like, I'm one person. We're all just one people. And it's sad to say, but like, I'm in a group chat with like the majority of like Arab and Muslim journalists like on my phone. Like, we all know each other. Like, one person interviews, so we all know who's interviewing. It's a tiny world. Journalism is a tiny world. People don't assume. Add any other qualifier, add gender, add race, add religion, it's only going to get smaller. And so I think when we're thinking of support, yes, from an editorial perspective, but I think so much needs to change from a systematic perspective so that we can rebuild that trust. Absolutely, there's no trust between marginalized communities and media, and for good reason. But when you have us come in and then we have to handhold, I have to tell my source, what does off the record mean? If I'm talking to somebody in DC, best believe I'm not teaching them anything. You're going to give me a quote, I'm going to use it, and I'm not going to give you time. But if I'm talking to someone who's dealing with trauma, who's died in the aftermath of an earthquake, who is trying to grapple with learning and getting their documented status here, and they're already hesitant, I'm not going to use words like off the record, sources, on background. I have journalists who don't know what that means. But you're going to give that empathy, because this is where empathy is allowed, that it gets misconstrued for objectivity. That all of a sudden you're not objective because you're being empathetic to someone that you're talking to. Depending on who I'm speaking to, my tone is going to change. If someone's a person in power, damn straight, I'm going to hold you accountable. If someone who's grieving and mourning and wants to tell their story of that, of course I'll meet you 2, 3, 4 times. Of course I'll let you fact check your quote because that's your right as a consumer. Of course I'll let you understand. I'm not going to let you see the draft of my story. That's never going to happen, no matter how many times I get asked this question. But I'll let you know in terms of what's the next steps in my editorial process. And that's how we build those conversations. And most journalists just don't have the time to do it. To be honest, it's a fast-paced industry. It's just like, if you're not going to give me a quote and I can publish it in the next 10 minutes, I'm probably not going to interview you. So I think being smart in terms of who you're speaking with and who you're sitting with is incredibly important in order for us to build foundational change so that the next set of journalists, when they're writing these stories, they're doing that. They're writing stories. They're not hand-holding anymore.
And I think with that very impassioned call to action for all of us, and I think this was a huge part of this panel, is we want to talk to you guys, the journalists who are working. How can we harness our anger? How can we harness our frustration into something beneficial, something that, as a community we can stand behind? And I think that your last response was really apt and really appropriate for us to kind of get it together as a community, put in that work so that you guys are focused on when you come to speak to us, we know what to say and we know how it's going to turn out, and we know how it's going to be published, and we have full trust in that. And so with that call to action, I'm going to open up the floor for a Q&A session for our panelists here specifically. If anyone has any direct questions that they would like to ask before we close off.
So I was curious how you guys navigate this, because I noticed that at least in mainstream media outlets, that there's a different language, specifically in reference to October 7th, of how they treat the victims on either sides. So when it comes to you guys, how do you navigate being unbiased when that's kind of the norm of using terms such as someone being killed is Palestinian, but someone being murdered is Israeli? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you just do it. You just have to do it. I think language is incredibly important, and I think being a reporter covering, a marginalized community, you're already very self-aware in terms of how language and the implicit language can or cannot influence a reader. And so for me, I think it's just writing things. I think writing things as clearly and plainly as possible as a journalist is the standard to go. If you do anything in journalism, the passive voice is very much frowned upon. You never write in passive. You get to edit it out all the time. You have a very limited word count to begin with, and so things get cut very quickly. So I think just being concise, being clear, and speaking, and don't speak in passive voice. I think if we're going to hold that accountability for all stories that we write, it should be just that, holding that same rule and that same standard for all stories that we write. It shouldn't be that complicated.
Any other live questions?
We talked about holding a mirror to our community and sometimes that not being the prettiest picture. How do you balance that with also, covering, how do you as a journalist choose which of those stories that don't shed us in the best light, that you choose those as well as, other stories that kind of balance things out?
That's a great question. I think having the same standards and values for all my stories is important. Consistency is key, and what's going to keep your own personal biases in check, and also understanding what's actually worth and what's valuable to a reader and what's not. So some things are evident. If there's something that's happening in the news and that we have to cover, then I have to cover it. If something is committed, I think down the street here at Masjid Ahmad, there was the imam was attacked or something during prayer, and I think the person who did so was of Muslim background, right? And so it is what it is. Some of these things, it is what it is. And I think being again clear and consistent in everything in terms of the reporting is really important to hold that just as a baseline. So I think that helps. For example, when I did my domestic violence story, it was incredibly important for me to do because there were women who were being killed, right? And of course, it makes it, and I remember having the stress I was writing and reporting the story because I'm already thinking about the biases that are out there. Right? I'm already thinking about what if someone takes the story and says, well, this is why your men are oppressive and your women are oppressed. These are your stories, it's written in your name. And I'm very much wary of that. And I think there has to be a line between writing a story because there's a greater goal to the story. It's not doing it to shame. It's not doing it to put blame, but it's doing it because there's a greater purpose. And I think the greater purpose here is that within this marginalized community, there are some marginalized communities, right? And so in this particular sphere, there were women who were fleeing for their lives, who were being harmed, who were being killed. And it was something that we needed to talk about. Now, how do I balance it out? I balance it out with facts, right? I think anyone who knows me knows that I'm very obsessive over my statistics. I'm very obsessive over facts. I very clearly wrote in that story, right, domestic violence in the Muslim community is not more prevalent than any other faith community, right? And there was a study where I had listed all of the other faith communities compared to the non-faith communities, and you saw that domestic violence plagued all communities quite clearly. I had a line in my story that very clearly said that domestic violence doesn't discriminate, that this is something that impacts all people, right? And so just laying that out was really important. I had an expert come in, an imam come in, a friend of ours, Khalid Latif, who I think most of us know quite well, who said very plainly, who just like, I had domestic violence, Muslim domestic violence, Muslim survivors of domestic violence come up to me who were children and who were elderly. And I know plainly it's not an issue of Islam, right? And he had said it so beautifully, and he had gone on to explain, he's just like, when you have a perpetrator of violence, you have an abuser, they're going to use anything that they can hold, whatever that they can proclaim for them to be powerful. Sometimes that's religion, sometimes that's money, sometimes it's status, right? It's going to differ. It's when you have all of that in your story, and it was incredibly important that I laid all of that in. My editors agreed. No one tried to fight me to cut any of it out. I was like, this is incredibly important to tell a holistic image. Then I feel comfortable with the story going out. So we're highlighting the issue because it's an issue that needs to be spoken about, but also the statistics are there, the experts are quoted, and it's all there. Now, there's a lot of tawakkur that goes into it. I can't control every single person who's going to use my journalism for nefarious reasons, right? I can't control people who are going to use this and say, this is why, we need to save your women, and this is why your men are terrible. That's going to exist, but that's going to exist whether or not I write the story. So I think there's a huge pros and cons list that goes in my head. I think just as a person of faith, there's a lot of dua and a lot of istikhara that I make behind every single one of the stories that I write. And also listening to people who know better than me. There's a lot of research, and I'm talking to a lot of experts and talking to a lot of other journalists who've done this work. And I think when you do that holistically and you do it with good intentions, then you're right, the right story ends up being published. But if you're just rushing, I think oftentimes that's where it gets really sloppy, really messy. And not someone who is perhaps, again, malintent, but I think it can come from a consequence of just rushing. And that's a terrible habit that we have in journalism. People are constantly, journalists are constantly rushing. But if you have a sensitive topic, I think my biggest advice is not to rush. Talk to everyone that you can talk to. Get the support that we were talking about earlier. And then, when you're writing these more sensitive stories, it's really important to have that. So I think that was one example. Another quick example I had written about was racism and colorism in our Muslim and Arab communities, and specifically I've written after that the death of George Floyd and a lot of the store owners of these bodegas who happen to be Arab and Muslim, and the treatment of their Black customers. That was another one that I know had mixed feelings from my readers as well, that I wholeheartedly stand by. But again, the process in writing that story and other stories that I will in the future is probably going to be a lot more slower in pace than perhaps my breaking news stories.
Just want to add on top of that consistency and standards is so important, and that goes both for stories that people may feel, that may shed a bad light, but also goes for other stories. We had a meeting with local ad readers and our editors just to talk about coverage, and what people thought about how we were covering our communities. And one of the things that was shared with us was, you really just want to be in your everyday stories. When you're talking about, teachers, or you're talking about what's happening in council, or you're talking about, what people think about the upcoming election. We're really involved in our communities, and we want that represented in your stories. So applying that standard, making sure that you include all voices, and then when there is something that maybe is a little more controversial, you have to apply the same standard to those communities as well. And if it's a story that we have to cover, we do have to, like I said, apply those same standards. Just one example was we had a social media influencer who was from this community who was scamming people for money, and it was pretty big scheme, and some people didn't want to talk about it because it was either embarrassing, it felt like it was embarrassing, or because they need family. And I understand that, but it's such an important cautionary tale to talk about what's happening and what they call affinity scams, which is kind of putting on trust within their own community when people identify with them. So that's the kind of thing that you have to think about the bigger picture. What's an important story, and why why you're writing it, and apply that standard as you would other groups.
Thank you for sharing. Any other questions? Okay. I'm gonna go to you and then you.
Okay, hi. So you touched upon the sort of fast-paced nature of journalism and media, and I kind of wanted to, I don't know if everyone else feels this way, but there feels like everything is kind of breaking news, the sensationalization of journalism and media. A lot of people are unable to differentiate between, really important stories that we, like everyone needs to have their attention on right now versus, stories that are important but maybe not, shouldn't be at the center of the entire conversation. So how do you as individual journalists, differentiate between what is breaking news and what is more so an important story but not centered, not the center of it? And what do you have to say about sort of sensationalization of media and journalism?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. It's one that I think about a lot because again, I work in like social news media, and so like our deadlines are like, a couple of hours and we're making videos, and oftentimes I feel like that genre of media often is like guilty of a lot of like over sensationalization stories. When I'm pitching something, I often try to think of like, is this something with lasting consequences? Is this illuminating a larger issue? Is this something that's shedding light on something systemic, or is this just like a one-off random story that like everyone will forget about in 2 days and really doesn't have larger implications aside from the fact that it happened? So that's how I differentiate that for me.
This is a big issue, but talking about the nature of breaking news, and I find that a lot of times when I cover issues, my biggest competition are citizen reporters who are, rushing to write about what is happening, and like at an event or at an occasion, and I will say, or they'll tweet out what the governor just said about some issue, and what I try to do, and I think what we all try to do, is offer a deeper perspective and more context about what's in breaking news. I mean, we do have breaking news reporters, and occasionally I'm in that role, but most of the time I'm trying to take a wider, deeper look at an issue, which is why I hope that you don't just read that social media, that like tweet or that infographic or look at that quick video, but we go beyond that to look, that's important, but also look for the bigger story. We are trying, to take. I mean, that's our goal as people, is to take a deeper look at these issues and to explain why things are happening and how people feel about them, and offer different perspectives. And we hope that that people understand that look beyond that first that first breaking news alert, and keep searching for and keep reading for or watching and following what's happening, because we're working really hard. Sometimes when a story comes out, it looks, it might not be super long, it might be very clear, but the amount of work and reporting that goes into each individual story is often, far beyond what you can see from just reading or looking at the pictures or videos. So it's so that's what I just want to say. All kinds of media are important, and we're trying to give that traditional perspective, which is more context, more depth to what you're seeing.
Thank you for sharing. I mean, the message is read. Get out of those WhatsApp groups. But I know we had another question. Yes, go.
I don't know if you saw the New York Times did a story on Clifton, like the Palestinian community in Patterson, Clifton, and it struck me, it didn't really hold a candle to a lot of what you have done, especially since October 7th. And the reason why, I think, is because you have like a decade of experience in this community, right? And the New York Times reporter who parachuted didn't have that. And I've cried with some of your stuff, honestly. And, I wonder, do you think about the like impact you have on like non-Palestinian like communities in New Jersey? That's one. Oh, sorry. And then to everyone else, I spoke alongside Rashid Tlaib at a vigil for journalists killed in Gaza at the Capitol last week, and one of the things that we said was that journalists in the U.S. shouldn't just call for their protection, right? But they should also honor them by reporting better about
you know, I'm glad that my stories connect with you. I do try for human or emotional impact with my stories. I think that's really important. Whether they're reaching non-Palestinian audiences, I mean, I hope our readership is very diverse. We have, like I said, we're not catering to any one kind of audience. We have very, you know, we have it's, you know, people in our communities from all crossroads, from all backgrounds who are reading. I certainly hope that the stories are right that try to shed light on other points of view or other perspectives, reach, you know, everyone. I know that people see it, and you know, sometimes people respond to it, but you know, that's the hope. That's why we do what we do. And I will say that very often what you see in television news and national papers originated with a local story, and it happens a lot. And it's just, you know, sometimes we get credit, sometimes we don't, but it's very common that stories that start locally reverberate nationally.
I definitely take a lot of inspiration, I think, from like the strength of the journalists on the ground in Gaza. I'm sure a lot of people do. I think the work they do is so vital. They're documenting what's happening in real time. A lot of them are speaking in a language that's not their first language. They're doing it for a global audience. They're doing it for people like us, so that we can consume the news, so that we know what's happening. So yeah, I definitely take a lot of inspiration from them. I think we as journalists and as an industry can do a lot better to, one, call for their protection, but also two, to acknowledge the work that they're doing, because I think oftentimes there's a lot of like an attitude amongst a lot of like Western media or Western journalists that like the work that local journalists do is less objective or less powerful or less impactful, and that it needs to be validated by like a Western outlet coming in and reporting on the exact same thing that those reporters have been reporting on from day one. So if there's anything that I'd want to see more from the industry, it's probably that, more of an acknowledgement of the work that they put in, and the accuracy of the work that they put in, and like the fact that they're under so much pressure, that just because they're also experiencing what's been happening in Gaza alongside people in Gaza doesn't make their work less valuable.
Yeah, facts. I think local coverage, whether we're talking about Hanan's work or we're talking about people in Gaza, as someone who works for national media outlet, is vital and critical, is the lifeline for all news. And if we don't sustain them, then this industry is going to crumble. And I say this from a place of privilege, and so I give a lot of credit. I read Hanan's work regularly as I do Reem's, but I think there needs to be a lot more acknowledgement. And in that same breath, I struggle with this question because of how much it hurts me. If I remember the fact that the Nobel Peace Prize folks made a category for the Ukrainian journalists that have yet to do the same for those in Gaza, when I think about Wa'ed Dahdour, who lost his wife, his children, his friends, and just recently had to leave Gaza to go to Egypt to get medical treatment, but how he is an empire on his own. When I think about all of the journalists in Gaza who are not only reporting on what's happening because no one else can. Literally no other journalists are able to go into Gaza, right? And so I think, someone was commentating to me and was saying, I think, why are we seeing so much, right? It just feels like with every conflict or every single time something happens in Palestine, generally speaking, like this time we see so much. And it's because of their work, period, right? It's because of their work and the content that they're producing day in and day out, despite the same fact that they also can't find water, despite the fact that they are also losing family members. And so I think it is, to say a disservice is putting it lightly. It is a shame that our industry has not spoken out more fearlessly, more strongly, and just without any if, and, or buts to talk about the work that they've been doing. And so I think I know if they may not get their credit now, they're going to get it later. Because history always finds its way, and recognizing the leaders when it was most important, and when they didn't get that proper credit. And so I think that gives me hope. To say inspiration feels lacking. But it's a vitality that I think we, and by saying we, I think journalists may not recognize their value now, but I know very much when, our kids are in school and their kids are in school and we're looking back at this and everyone is questioning where they were at this point in time, I look forward to the day that other journalists in my industry do the same.
Thank you, all for answering those questions, and I think that specific last question, really hit, close to home, and I hope you're all feeling the, urgency that we should all be feeling with the current state of the world and the ramifications of that on the journalism industry. We're gonna take one last question, and then, from there, we're gonna transition to food, and then we're gonna do our second panel. So we'll do one more question. Oh God, I gotta do this to myself for so many people. Better do anything you want to know, no joke. Yeah, I said there's someone, okay.
Just to wrap up, I think it's interesting because you started by talking about media literacy and a big issue overall, but since October 7th has been like misinformation. And it's such a struggle talking to like my friends who aren't Muslim, who are like hearing things on the news that just are not like true, that are like fundamentally not based in truth, and then having to like sort of fight against that and be like, well, I've seen this direct coverage and it completely contradicts what you just witnessed. And I think as journalists, part of that is like picking your sources. I know like at my college paper, I pushed and said like, we can't use the IDF as like a source for things. We just can't because the stuff they say just isn't true. So how do you combat that, both in your conversations with people in real life and then also in the newsroom when it comes to reporting accurate information?
I mean, certainly there are some sources that, you might find more trustworthy than others, but what's important is that if you see disinformation or you see wrong information, that you report it, because sometimes the editor may not be aware. Oftentimes that's the case. I've actually brought to my attention, to the attention of an editor, like editors, like something I thought was incorrect in one or two stories, and they addressed it. But that's sometimes I hear people who have an issue or complain with a certain story, but sometimes there's something in there that's unintended, and people don't notice that that maybe this source is compromised, or maybe this report isn't fully telling isn't fully accurate or fair. And I think if you have an issue, raise it. Not everything. We don't respond to every reader. I mean, we take in every reader request. We're not reactionary. We're not going to change what we do. But if we see something that we feel is like a legitimate concern with the story, it's we'll pay attention for sure to that concern. So I say, if you see this information, bring it up.
Yeah, I agree. I think people assume that when you don't, or if you email editors, it goes into a black hole, and we usually almost always have someone that's reading these requests. Oftentimes, not often, we cannot respond to all of them. So if you see something, I would, always email the standards editor, email the reporter. Oftentimes, I get emails all the time of something as small as perhaps having like a date be incorrect, or sometimes we've seen reporters at other outlets completely change like bodies of their story for whatever reason. And the majority of the time, it doesn't, I agree with Hannah, that it's ignorance. And again, so many people are working on one story. It's through the edits and through the changes, things get wonky and chopped up and then ends up getting published because so many people have looked at it. It gets published at odd hours of the night. Reporters publishing it after working on it for 36 hours straight. And so I think giving that gesture of kindness and that thought process first. And I know that isn't the gut reaction of many, especially during like a really tense time right now. I think most of the time, and this does make me die a little bit inside every time, is people will screenshot the story and then tweet at like the reporters and the editor and bring thousands of people to hate on that person, and all of a sudden, that reporter's inbox is barraged with hate mail, and they can't actually address perhaps the issue or the concern that was in the story. Of course, time and place for everything. I think like we're all very smart people here. We know when something is perhaps a little bit more malicious and something that can be corrected. So if it's a situation that can be corrected, I think the right thing to do is just to have a conversation with that reporter and that editor and to contact that newsroom. There's a reason why our emails are public. It's not that hard to find. The masthead for most news organization is very easy to find. Reporters tend to have their DMs open on any of these platforms. So it requires more work, and it's not gonna make you go viral if you were just to like hate tweet a reporter's article. However, you are more likely to get more positive results. And again, depending on the story, I think using judgment is incredibly important. And I think, you know, from the editorial side, this applies to breaking news, but I apply it for almost everything. When something is breaking, then like a mass shooting, for example, we always wait for a second and third source, right? So if someone's coming out, or if like a politician that's winning a race, right? If the AP called it, we're not going to publish it just because the AP called it. We're going to wait for someone else. And I think that also applies in the day-to-day journalism. If someone said something, can it be corroborated? Is there a second and third and fourth source? Is there a witness? Are there other objective researchers and think tanks and news outlets who can corroborate whatever claim that is being perpetrated and not just related to like October 7th, but anything? And I think Hannah and I were saying earlier, the consistency is really important. So if you see something that perhaps you think strikes a question and you said you've seen it more accurately reported, then I would send in those links as well. Because again, I think it becomes a numbers game more than anything. So I think just keeping those two things in mind is really helpful in terms of getting a meaningful change versus perhaps just piling off. Because like Hanan was saying earlier, oftentimes it's not the reporter. We don't write our headlines. That tends to be the thing that people hate the most. We never write our headlines. People are writing our headlines for us. We have audience teams for that. Sometimes the photo choice is not ours. Sometimes the chopped up quote happens somewhere along the line. So I think being thoughtful and having an open and honest conversation is the first way to go, but it's not the only way to go. But I would say it's the first way to go.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for your questions, and thank you to our panelists for an incredible conversation. Please give it up for them. Now we're gonna move and invite all of you to grab a bite, have some food, and to please come back for our second panel with our wonderful moderator, Namita, and our other three speakers, Amid, Dina, and Josie. So please enjoy the food, and we'll see you in a bit.
I just want to encourage you all to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, please, and just want to let you know that I'm updating those regularly. Just want to get that out there, and I also have a WhatsApp group. I'm going to leave out the QR code if anyone wants for readers.
Yeah, so please make sure you follow all of our speakers and talk to them, follow them, read their stories, post their stories, all that good stuff.
I just want to tell you, I'm going to leave this on the front table. If anyone wants to join, feedback on the stories or share stories with the community. Yeah, that's always cool.
Can I video you and then we can write it down? Like, can I get a video of it? And then we can like use it like.
I mean, honestly, I really just.
Can I just get like a voice note of it? So that like I can like put it in a post there. Okay, you can just tell them.
Would it be easier if I just text you?
Or like if you know something that you can like send it.
I promise. My name is
Okay. Okay. She's like Magdalene. But yeah, you can like send her a message and then we can use it as like a photos. Christina, so numbers don't kind of like I know some of the words, so like I don't know, but like I think I would say like years. So I do like all the social media on Twitter.
I think I have a really good friend.
Okay. I was like,
Yeah, I was just like, yeah, I know you, but you have no idea. That's okay, now that's more popular.
She was talking to me, what am I going to do? Get out of my face? I want to get in the back.
Yeah, no, we should. She's so great.
So in about 2 minutes or so, we are gonna separate to go pray off. We're gonna have the females pray in the main hall right outside, and the men congregate upstairs. And so in about like 2 minutes or so, let's wrap up. We'll go pray Oscar, then we'll come back for part 2 for our second panel. So, Zeka.
Yeah.
I'll connect with Sam. Yeah, you're the master of it.
You can follow me upstairs for prayer. The ladies will just pray outside, right? So whoever is upstairs, the ladies pray outside.
You're just trying different things. Yeah. Lesson learned. Yeah. And the way I have to call for the honestly, for any it's small. Yeah, if you have anything that like you're really struggling to put your application or you're looking for something. Yeah, I have to hear one. Keep it checking on it regularly. Therefore, I'm attracted. The less more, and then this way, it's like as things are people are online or they're just like also, now that we're related in a very loose and generic sense, I can easy active. I'm not going to like that. It's a very yeah, I love it. It's a very I don't remember when my mom
I like it. You know, is there anything good? I didn't know that. You know what? This was actually me. I was planning to somewhere.
Some of them are not good. So people will talk about it.
No, I wrote about it, but I wasn't there. I remember thinking of it. Oh, so you know what is this? It was an election. Over that.
What's up?
Still live streaming.
It's almost like a blog.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone had a chance to grab some food, and for those who need to pray, have a chance to pray. We're going to be moving on to the next part of our program. So next up, we have Zena, who is a student speaker. She's going to come up and perform some of her poetry for us and give a short speech. And then after that, we're going to move into our second panel. So please welcome her and settle down.
Assalamu alaikum, and peace be with all of you. My name is Zena, and I just wanted to have a few words for the journalist community. I've always admired journalism, and there was just something I noticed, and it's about the context given to what's happening now in Palestine. So as we know, based on October 7th, context is important. That context being 70 years of settled colonization, 56 years of military occupation, and 17 years of besiegement. And I'd like for the collective journalism community to come to terms with a fact about what the underlying issue of this is. It's not about religion. My mom, when she was in Gaza, grew up with Christian neighbors who would come to their Ramadan feasts and she would go to their Christmas feasts. My dad grew up in Yafa, which is currently colonized, and he was so influenced by the Jewish refugees who were his neighbors that he spoke more Yiddish than he spoke Arabic. This war isn't about politics. It's no one in Gaza's demand to take the oil and sell it on a quick buck on the international market. And as you know, people say, I don't want to be political in this, and there's no politics in this at all, from what I can see. And lastly, a very grave misconception. This isn't about land. I remember seeing a sign of someone at a protest saying, you can't defeat a nation that knows that this is not the end. And it comes to my mind that we as Palestinians, or at least from Gaza's perspective, this world is so temporary that we're so immaterial. And even thinking about before 1948, when they accepted all those refugees, had it been about land, they would have never accepted them. So the question is, what is the underlying issue? It's human rights. It's denying human rights. Because no person should be kicked out of their home just on the basis of ethnicity, or become refugees in their own country, or be treated like animals in walls, or be killed for resisting. So the greater implication of this is saying that this war is based on religion or politics or land is denying that Palestinian identity. It reinforces this erasure of our Palestinian identity. Simply decades of bloodshed to just politics or disputes about land that just completely denies our Palestinian identity and exposes it to a risk of extinction. And I'd like to point out the way the media portrays this pivotal fact. It's kind of referenced in our everyday lives that we're allowed to be whatever we identify as, but not as Palestinians. Because as Palestinians, when we are in the House of Representatives and we speak about our identity, we're censured by 234 colleagues. Because when a Palestinian model expresses her identity, she loses her jobs. Because when a Palestinian physician speaks out against oppression, he loses his job. Because when a small 6-year-old boy is stabbed 26 times, his crime is just his ethnicity. And we see this cost of Palestinian identity to be so expensive. It costs you your respect, your job, and sometimes your life. So, in an attempt to preserve Palestinian identity, we go through many other outlets, such as poetry, or books, memoirs. And this is something I'd like to read to you guys. It's called Dear Palestinian Ancestors. Dear Palestinian Ancestors, there are too many words I wish to express to you, starting with, I'm sorry we never had the chance to meet. I'm sorry I never learned your story. I'm sorry we are forced to see history repeat. I'm sorry our minds are filled with worry. I'm sorry I didn't save you in 1948. I'm sorry your kindness was taken for granted. I'm sorry your land is now stench with hate. I'm sorry your children aren't wanted. I'm sorry your children write wills before reaching puberty. I'm sorry all your children have PTSD and anxiety. I'm sorry all your children expect war over prosperity. I'm sorry your infants don't see the world past infancy. I'm sorry that hope is a foreign thought. I'm sorry allies have turned a blind eye. I'm sorry children don't grow, they get shot. I'm sorry they don't have power to defy. Dear Palestinian ancestors, I'm sorry your children die from thirst and hunger. I'm sorry your women die from cold and bombing. I'm sorry your men die from beatings and hunger. I'm sorry the whole world is just sitting there watching. I'm sorry I didn't inherit your dark complexion. I'm sorry I didn't inherit fluency in our native tongue. I'm sorry I didn't inherit a strong cultural connection. I'm sorry I didn't inherit your lands, not one. I'm sorry I couldn't preserve the home you broke your back to build. I'm sorry that I can't locate or visit your grave. I'm sorry my privilege of life only wrecks me with guilt. I'm sorry I don't understand how you were so brave. Dear Palestinian ancestors, I'm sorry I don't own the narrative of our people. If I did, I would have told them of your olive trees. I would show them its bark so tall and regal, how the fruit falls from a graceful breeze. I would show them the pomegranates and lemons. I'd take them to a historic church and mosque, show them the walls riddled with oppression. I'd show them our greatest landmark. I'd show them the landmark I am denied to see. I'd show them the wall that marks us as animals. I'd show my stolen house. All that's left is a key. I'd show them broken hearts and their bandages. I'd show them the symbol of freedom is our debka. I'd tell them the beat of our strong, unwavering drums. I'd teach them history, the diaspora, the Nekba. I'd say we are all Palestinians in our millions in our tongues. Dear Palestinian ancestors, I lost 24,927 of my brothers and sisters. I lost 800,000 olive trees. I lost 3 churches and 104 mosques. I lost all sense of ease. Dear Palestinian ancestors, I have hope. I have hope our God will serve our justice. I have hope our God will ease our suffering. Because my Palestinian brothers and sisters taught me hope and devotion. They taught me truth and emotion. They taught me strength and resistance, and they taught me love and persistence. I realized I embody your bravery. I realized I scream with your ferocity. I realized I fight with your tenacity, and I realized I am proud of my ancestry. Dear Palestinian ancestors, there are too many words I wish to express to you, ending with, I'm sorry I never got to thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lena, for sharing your beautiful art and poetry with us and sharing your vulnerability with us. Next up, I want to introduce our second and final panel, which will be moderated by Munira Samra. Munira Samra is an Egyptian-American video journalist that recently graduated with a master's degree in broadcast journalism from the American University of Cairo. Her stories have been published on Reuters, Sky News Arabia, and The Independent. Without further ado, we'll have Munira come up as well as the rest of our panelists.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. All right, we have a real treat for you guys for the second panel. Please welcome to the stage Dina Said Ahmed, Amir Al-Khadafi, and Josie Gonzalez. How are you guys doing? Everybody get their food? Yes. Okay. Dina Said Ahmed comes from a wealth of experiences, having worked at CBS News, Al Jazeera English, The Intercept, where she produced news analyst videos presented by Mark Lamont Hill and Mehdi Hassan, respectively. Her journalism work largely covers the Middle East, North Africa, and state surveillance. Dina is also a law student at Rutgers School of Law. Welcome, Dina. Josie Gonzalez is a founder and executive director of Public Square Amplified, a local nonprofit news organization. Josie has built a career spanning over 28 years in the NGO sector, serving in various executive capacities. She brings decades of experience and expertise to building 501c3 entities. Additionally, she has published editorials on a variety of topics. Ms. Gonzalez was born in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and remains involved in the NGO sector, serving as the lead on the resiliency initiative with rural women agriculture producers. Okay. And then lastly, we have Amir Al-Khadafi. Amir Al-Khadafi is a founder, journalist, and creative director based in Jersey City, New Jersey. At an early age, Amir was drawn to spending as much time as possible online with special interest in building community through social media. Amir's work is devoted to ensure Muslims are perceived accurately in newsrooms while he continues to build Muslim Co., a mainstream media publication centering Muslim news and content. Okay, so for the first question, I kind of have a general question for you guys. Pew Research reports that 3 in 10 U.S. adults reported getting their news from Facebook in 2023. And 50% of X users say they get their news from that social media site. Do you believe that broadcast journalism is more trustworthy than digital? And should viewers be more selective about the kind of news they consume?
For sure. Hey, welcome everybody. Thank you guys. Thank you guys so much for having me. Thanks for the Muslim for putting this together and for PACC for hosting this event. I think it's very crucial during this time. So it's a pleasure that I can share my insights and anything that I can for this current situation. So when I hear this question, I actually want to clarify because I don't think broadcast journalism is necessarily not trustworthy. I think right now we're seeing distrust in legacy media. So broadcast journalism is just a form of like getting news out there, right? Whether that's on TV or digital media, where it's through social media. Right now we're seeing a lot of distrust in legacy media. So, you know, we've all seen how the New York Times has been covering what's going on in Gaza since October 7th, been started. And we're seeing this like combat for once, right? Like the readers, the people are being upset. And it's been an ongoing thing, you know. I feel like Muslims are always the brunt of when, you know, things like this arise. We're always being seen, we're always being reported on very negatively. So right now, I feel like we're at a time where everyone has access to a phone, a device, an iPad. So it makes news more accessible, right? So when things happen where we have this trust against legacy media right now, we're pivoting towards people that we find trustworthy. And what I love to see, what I love seeing right now is that we're following through with our sources, right? We're seeing a huge wave of people following, you know, journalists like Mutaz, Bassam, Wa'il, Bilal, Anas, it could go on and on and on. Bastia, when she was in Gaza, we're seeing like a lot of people who are using their limited time, their limited access to internet on the ground, their limited resources to eyewitness account of what's going on. So we're seeing a huge wave of people, you know, dismissing legacy media and their biases, and we see right through it and following sources on the ground right now. So it's a huge wave, and we're seeing like a big report right now as well. Just recently, the Washington Post had reported that users are disbanding their trusted legacy media, and we're seeing more independent platforms, independent creators, journalists, and influencers building platforms, and a lot of the readers are pivoting towards following those crowds. So it's a new wave right now.
I think it's kind of a mixed wave, at least in my personal experiences. But like Amy said, there is, legacy media has been building this foundation of distrust for decades now. The New York Times, for example, they manufactured stories about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that was proven to be false. Later, very recently, like the past few months, they started a story about beheaded babies in Gaza, and that turned out to be entirely false. So they have been, for a very long time, like chopping away at their own credibility. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that they're entirely cancelable, that we should throw them out entirely. I think it is important to still read what the New York Times puts out, what the Washington Post puts out. But there's also, we have to be aware that there are, we have options now, right? It's not like we live in a place where it's like one state-sponsored media outlet that you can watch on TV. We have a lot of options. You have the citizen journalists who are, their stories are really important to also watch, because Bisan, like we've all seen, she's been taking us into the tents in Gaza. She's been taking us to places in Gaza that other journalists physically cannot go. They cannot do this. And you have the opposing side of this, where you have like CNN, for example, and their reporters who are embedding with the IDF. And when you embed with the Israeli occupation, when you embed with those forces, anything you publish has to be okayed by them first. They have to review it first. So it's really, CNN is quite literally a PR machine for Israel. ABC News did the same thing. The Associated Press had a journalist there doing the same thing. So it is really important that you watch what they're putting out, but at the same time, you're also diversifying what you're watching. Al Jazeera has been doing phenomenal work on Gaza right now and in the past. But then at the same time, like again, I also add a little caveat that we can't just cancel out all of these other bigger outlets or mainstream outlets, because they do have their biases, but at the same time, there are redeemable journalists within the New York Times, for example, within Washington Post, within HuffPost, all these other outlets. Like when Shirin Abu Akleh was killed in 2022, when she was killed by Israel, the New York Times expended resources reconstructing the moments before she was killed and the moments after she was killed. And up until the New York Times report, Israel was entirely denying that they had shot Shirin. They just entirely denied that. But once the New York Times report came out, the narrative started shifting. The Washington Post also jumped on it and said, oh yeah, Shirin was killed by Israeli occupation forces. So, and this is entirely because the head of the video department at the New York Times, he's a nice Irish guy. So he put this together, he put that work in, and that's what we saw. So it's not entirely cancelable, but at the same time, you do need to still diversify your sources. You can't just watch CNN, you can't just watch New York Times, you can't just watch Al Jazeera. I think you should absolutely watch Al Jazeera, but you should also add in other sources, just so that you're aware of what's going on from every, you're more well-rounded in your approach.
I'm sitting all the way over this way because I am 10 days out of COVID. So I'm public amplified is 2 years old, and I'm not a trained journalist, and I see public square amplified as a space to explore issues of power and positioning. And so to your question, right, and sort of expanding on it, I think we have to sort of be clear understanding that journalism is grounding in white supremacy. That journalism is designed to perpetuate settler colonization ideas about who we are and how we show up. So to address the issues of journalism, you have to address settler colonialism. You also have to address capitalism, which is a function of settler colonialism. So when we talk about broadcast journalism and media journalism, so I'm one of those who look at I-24 and Al Jazeera and many others. To
to understand, and this is for the, actually the young student who said that, IDF is the source, IDF actually is a source. It is a source being used actually at the ICJ, so it is a source. So if we are going to address the function of journalism, then we have to unpack how we understand the hundreds of years of journalism. So there were journalism schools, and Ida B. Wells was a journalist, right?
Yeah.
There were journalism schools when Thomas Paine launched his paper, right? You all know Thomas Paine. But in journalism school, and Frederick Douglass wrote his pieces, or Benjamin Franklin, right? So journalism has become codified, and it's codified because language matters, ideas matter. And to control ideas, you must control the systems and the apparatus that disseminate information. And so I think that's what we have to unpack. It's not about broadcast journalism or digital or journalism. It's to understand who owns the power of context and construct in designing, in the curation and consumption of who we are and how we show up for each other.
Very interesting answers. Context matters. Yeah, that's the lesson I take from that. To the point that you said earlier, it actually goes into my next question when you were talking about the beheaded babies. Misinformation can spread very quickly if it's coming from the right source. President Biden, in a speech, he mentioned beheaded babies, and then the White House later had to retract that statement. What lessons can consumers learn from that lie that was misconstrued and taken back, and how should we move forward in our trust in the media and the sources that we normally deem credible, such as the White House?
So I think that's it's a bit hard to answer that question because we're not in Gaza right now. We can't. The only when I was working in journalism, the only way that you would report on something is if you are physically there. If you're not physically there, you cannot report on a story. If I am not at this mosque at this specific time, with the community members telling what had happened, then I cannot report about an imam's shooting or an imam's killing. I would have to either rely on police sources, which are used as a source, or I would have to, also be, I have to compound that with being on the ground. So it's hard to say, what should we trust or what should we not trust. But I think it's important to look at track records. And again, we've seen the fabrication of beheaded babies. We've seen that story. We've seen the fabrication of weapons of mass destruction. We've seen, during the Iraq War, President Bush, who is also supposed to be a source of news for us, he was also discounting or discrediting the Iraq death toll report. And President Biden did the same exact thing. So we see these things that are happening over and over. It's a cycle. So again, it's I do emphasize how important it is to ensure that the sources that you're getting your news from are diversified. You can't just rely on the biggest news outlet. The New York Times does have some great work. Washington Post has some great work, but they cannot be your only source. But then you also have to question again, how are these reporters getting their information? Are they embedded with the IDF? Are they a mouthpiece for the IDF? Or are they somebody like Mahdoud, who is really, what he's doing is reporting his lived experience, right? He's a journalist from Gaza, native to Gaza, living in Gaza. Before the war, after the war, he's going to still be in Gaza. These are journalists who, they're not going to, put on a facade the way that Clarissa Ward does for CNN. And she's very theatrical, right? Wael is not doing that. He's putting his life on the line to bring us these stories. And these are the local journalists. The way I mentioned it earlier. Local journalists don't get the credit that they need or that they deserve. And journalists like Clarissa go to places like Gaza, they go to places like Afghanistan, and they hire fixers who are people from the area, local to the area, so that they can get them around, they can show them around. A lot of times Clarissa Ward does not speak Arabic, she does not speak Pashto, she does not speak anything but English and French. But she'll go to these places, to our homes, and hire somebody who's local to the area to basically do the reporting for her, and then it goes under her name, right? She changes some words, she adjusts the style of it so it can match the AP style, and then it goes out under her name. But the source is really, it's not her. She's not the source, right? So we have to always question or, look back and find out, what did these reporters do? Who are these reporters? Personally, I think that foreign correspondence is a huge issue within journalism because they hire these white people who come out from, Europe, from America. They go for a few days to Afghanistan, to Gaza, actually not Gaza because they can't go there. But they go wherever else they go. They stay a few days, they do their report, and then they come back. And they don't have the context that you need. They don't have the knowledge that you need to do this sort of work. A lot of times they don't have the background. They may have like a master's degree or bachelor's degree in Middle East studies, but a 4-year academic setting is not going to be a supplement for a lived experience. So you always have to question your source and again, just diversify where you get your news from.
Yeah, sourcing is a huge piece, right? So we know from history that the stories of civil rights workers, the stories of the killings of civil rights workers and protesters came into our ecosystem and still exist within our complex about how we think about what we're grappling with, right? Because anti-blackness gives us Islamophobia. It also gives us anti-Semitism. It gives us, because white supremacy gives you oppression, it gives you anti-blackness, it gives you patriarchy, it gives you misogyny, it gives you all of that. So sourcing is really critical. And I'll give you an example, and then I'll come back to sort of the larger context of journalism being a part of an anti-colonial experience. So at Public Square and Provide, as a publisher, I try to sort of figure out how do I cover the community of Palestinians wrestling with the current Israeli war in the Palestinian territory of Gaza. So how do we cover it? I didn't want to colonize it. So we waited and observed and tried to be thoughtful about it. So we did a photo essay of the Only Night rally in Newark to center the humanity of local Palestinians and their allies in the experience of wrestling with the pain and horror of a war so far away. So we did a photo essay. We also had one of our Palestinian young people present her speech. And actually, thank you, Zana. Please read Zana's piece in Public Square and Provide, and also look at the Palestinian photo essay on the rally, because sourcing is directly related to colonizing and how you colonize stories. And so, when we think about what we're trying to do in sort of movement or massive journalism, that sourcing is a big part of that. And so if you want to tell stories, that are anti-colonial stories, then you must use sources from the bottom up. The stories must be from the bottom up. And it takes money. The reason that you have those journalists, this is a part of why we don't have as many weeklies or dailies or my brother over there, his news organization or my news organization, that we struggle for money, we struggle to pay for stories, we struggle to tell those stories. So that's a huge part of it when you see these journalists showing up. They've got this backing, right? They've got money to support them. They've got money to find the sources. So for us, emancipatory journalism is critical. So part of that is decolonizing journalism and interrupting the way in which journalism schools have taught journalists to sharpen spaces, which is why we use community reporters and citizen journalists.
I just wanted to add one small factor to this. When we're saying like mass misinformation being published, especially on a mainstream scale, I'm coming from a background of someone who was a organizer, someone who was very active in my Students for Justice in Palestine chapter in Rutgers, New Brunswick, back in 2019 or so. And whenever, coming from like a mindset of like organizing and activism, when we see misinformation spread on a wide scale, it actually is like a tool to counteract a lot of the work on the ground of organizers and people who are fighting the fight for Palestine, right? They'll say, oh, 40 beheaded babies, burned and crisp, right? And then organizers who are fighting the fight on the ground now have to scramble to, put all the energy into saying this is false, proving that this is false. How can you prove that something is false when there's literally no evidence of its existence, right? We're, going off of like this one woman who's like, oh, I heard or seen, whatever that may be. And I just want to give caution and warning, especially because there's a lot of like students here that are very like proactive in their campuses and organizing. Do not feed into it. There are times where it's going to take up a lot of your energy into like disproving that something is false when it's not worth that battle to continue, moving forward and for the greater cause at hand here. So I just wanted to share that little aspect of it because I feel like it's so easy to just get caught in with like, oh, this like one lie that spread so far, and now we have to, take 10 steps back, and it's meant to like destabilize, movements and activism efforts.
Hey, Amir, Muslim is the largest media publication delivering news centering the Muslim community online. How do you see the role of media in shaping the perceptions of Muslims, and what responsibilities do media professionals like yourself have in this regard?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure if anyone, if most of you are familiar, but I'm the founder of Muslim, so we're the largest, most followed, media platform that cover news primarily just on the Muslim community. And we use social media for that. We use our digital tools to our advantage. We use TikTok, we use Instagram, we have a Snapchat show. We kind of just use all of our resources into making sure that Muslim news and Muslim voices are being heard. The whole goal of Muslim is to kind of act as a town hall per se for the Muslim community, just because we don't, it started as a project in university where I noticed that we kind of didn't have like a mainstream outlet or space for us to just come together and publish, and to talk about things that are impacting us, right? It started in the time during the Muslim travel ban, where I had roommates that were severely impacted by the ban that was imposed by our former president, Trump. And so when we did an entire report with the help of Diana Klein and Juan Gonzalez on how students on campus are affected by the Trump travel ban, I wanted to publish this story to a outlet to warn Muslim students about, do not trust your university, they're not your friends. And that's kind of where it came to be, where I was like, okay, there's no mainstream media outlet that's focused on the Muslim community to warn the Muslim community here. So the whole purpose of Muslim is to cover stories that are neglected on mainstream media, that you won't see get picked up on CNN per se. It's very unfortunate, but when things happen to the Muslim community, mainstream media does not want to cover it. And so, an example of a story that came to our attention was, I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar, but it's the case of Alat Masri. So Alat Masri, back in Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, she was a medic during a big demonstration that took place in Florida, and she was helping on the ground, and they were doing a mass arrest of just anyone that they saw. And so they detained Alat Masri, who was hijabi, and during her mugshot, removed her hijab. They removed her hijab during the mugshot, and then they broadcasted that mugshot across all local media stations at the time. So clearly, it went against her First Amendment rights. This is, to us in the Muslim community, right? This is like a story that's like our rights are violated, right? Alat Masri's rights are violated, but this also applies to all the hijabis, and if they're ever caught in a similar situation where, if they're ever caught, they have to do a mugshot, and, the hijab is So when we received this story as a tip and a lead, it concerned us. We were like, we have to follow up on the story because this is really big. At the time, I'm like doing a lot of research into this. You know, TMN wasn't publishing anything. No one was publishing anything on this, but to us in the Muslim community, I was just like, this is a story that needs to be heard. So we reached out to Anat. We covered her story. We published it onto Muslim, and it actually went viral. And it led to 330,000 petition signatures. Then, you know, CARE Florida actually picked up the case during that time. They were able to use the virality of that story and to use the petition signatures and get her charges dropped and have her mugshot removed, and then also have the police department do a formal apology, right? So the existence of Muslim as an independent platform that highlights and gives voice to the Muslim community, you won't see a story like Alat Masri's being published and amplified on mainstream news outlets because they would not care. They simply just would not care about Muslim stories. So the existence of Muslim to be publishing stories like Alat Masri's helps us, right? Everyone has a role to play. Every single organization has a role to play in the Muslim community. For me, it comes to media, right? I'll publish a story, I bring attention to it, I bring virality. Then you have an organization like CARE, who their role is to use that virality of that story and to have implement change and use that story to like fight the fight. Then you have other organizations, let's say the humanitarian crisis, right? During the Turkey earthquake in Syria, do you guys remember what was happening? It was the Super Bowl. So no one in mainstream America and the US cared about what happened in Turkey. They cared about that Rihanna was pregnant, right? Like, that was crazy. So during that time, I was on the grounds in Turkey. I'm getting all these stories straight up from like the people on the ground what's going on. A baby was rescued on the rebel. This was happening. You're not seeing that being broadcasted again in CNN in America and like mainstream media outlets. So the point that we're highlighting a story like this, the existence of a platform that's independent, that has this core focus, it helps not just the Muslim community, but all the other organizations that play a puzzle piece and a role into helping the Muslim community as a whole, right? Whether that's CARE, whether that's humanitarian organizations that are using the virality of a news story to help get funding and help them. So.
Yeah, I remember the outrage I felt when I saw her mugshot being broadcast. Because for me as a hijabi, it hit very close to home. So I'm really happy that we have a platform like Muslim that's publishing stories that center around us, around our community from our perspective. Dina, you work for the Council on Islamic American Relations. CARE has worked to promote positive image of Islam and Muslims in America through media relations, lobbying, and advocacy. Why is it important for CARE to facilitate conversations with local and federal government? And walk us through what that looks like for you in your job as a communication manager.
So I think to put it more accurately, we don't necessarily go out to promote a positive image of Islam. All we do is amplify the Muslim story, and that happens to be a positive image. So our job is not dawah, but sometimes it does become dawah. Our work, dawah is very subtly intertwined into our work, but it's not, we're not sitting outside with like YSM pamphlets or like giving dawah to people on the street. But it happens to be that, when you give a more nuanced, when you look at any community, not just Muslims, you look at them in a more nuanced way, in a more holistic way, you're going to see the good and you're going to see the bad. And that's all that we do at CARE. We're just showing our story as Muslims. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, but we focus mostly on the good. We do have, so it's, we have several, CARE, we're several puzzle pieces at CARE that all work together to help amplify the Muslim voice. And some of it is media work, some of it is government work, some of it is keeping track of the trends so that we can strategize better, so that we can understand our community better and move forward, in more with some sort of longevity or some sort of strategy. We do a lot of legal work, of course, and that's protecting the Muslim community, serving the Muslim community in that sense. We do a lot of programming, so that's serving the community in the sense that we're making sure our community understands not to speak with the FBI, for example, not to, consent to a search without a warrant, all these things. So it's a lot of different work that CARE does. And in terms of media, I'll give the example of what's happening right now in Gaza. When the war on Gaza first started, we were, normally we don't do a lot of international work. So if the work is not local, we're a local chapter, so if the work is not local, we don't really get meddled with it because it distracts from our mission, which is to serve the New Jersey Muslim community. But what was happening in Gaza was so grand, it was on such a large scale. The genocide in Gaza, it's on such a large scale, and it also has a very direct impact on our community here in New Jersey and in the U.S. as a whole. And how is that? One, we do have a sizable Palestinian population all throughout New Jersey, and they were very directly impacted by the war on Gaza right now. They've lost, we had a press conference at our office a few weeks ago where 7 families from New Jersey had come into our office to talk about their family members who were killed. And some of them were talking about their mothers and their fathers and their brothers, right? So they had direct, immediate family who were killed by Israel and Gaza. So that was one way that we were impacted. Another way, and that's how everybody in this room, as a Muslim or as a person of color or as Palestinian, is impacted, is we've seen a lot of the very dehumanizing, very imbalanced, very disingenuous narratives being put out, whether it's by elected officials, whether it's by a billboard company, whether it's by an organization like Jubilong that was putting out, that was, again, amplifying the 40 beheaded babies, the absolute lie, they were amplifying that. And all of this had a very direct impact on our community here in New Jersey specifically. We saw in a public school here in New Jersey, a Muslim girl who was wearing hijab, she was physically beat down to the ground. She was punched by one of her peers, while several others watched because she was wearing a sash, I guess you could call it, that had Palestine on it. So we saw that happening in schools. We saw at Cherry Hill, we saw other Muslim girls who also had their hijabs pulled off, and they were doxxed by their peers and their peers' parents, right? So it became this bullying campaign of minor students who were, not just by their own colleagues, but by their colleagues' parents too. We saw people getting fired from their jobs left and right, at Target, at accounting firms, at physicians. They were all people being fired from their jobs simply for posting in support of Palestine or in support of the Palestinian resistance. Meanwhile, we supported the Ukrainian resistance, nothing happened, right? But that's what we saw at CARE, and that's how it kind of came on. We had to start doing the work that we're doing, and it's a lot of it in terms of media is ensuring that our community's voices are amplified, that our stories amplify, that it's not just one-sided. And we have Hanan here in the audience who's done phenomenal work on ensuring that the Muslim community and the Palestinian community, their voices are amplified, especially now. She's been doing it for a very long time. So if you haven't read her work, please do go read her work. It's great. It's very balanced and it's very honest. And that's what we're trying to do at CARE, push our stories out to media to ensure a more balanced, a more holistic, a more honest coverage of our people. And to be fair, I think we've seen a little bit of that with this specific war in Gaza. Obviously, the coverage has been atrocious, but we've also seen a lot more Palestinian voices on TV. We've seen Noura Erkat taking interviews. We've seen, not to plug in Al Jazeera too much. I'm not just saying this as a former Al Jazeera producer, but I really do believe that Al Jazeera has been doing the work that no other outlet on an international scale has been doing. And they've been amplifying voices, again, like from BSAN. They've had a series with BSAN on their channels. They have, again, their own journalists. But to come back to the focus of what we're talking about right now, that's a lot of what we did, just making sure that our voices and our stories are being covered. And we do, because we've seen such a massive impact of the dehumanizing narratives, whether that's coming from the governor himself, whether that's coming from Josh Gotthein, whether that's coming from Mikey Sherrill, whoever, Bob Menendez, any of these elected officials, we've seen a direct impact of their words on our community, and we have the numbers. It's not just, my friend was targeted. No, we've seen, between October 7th and December 31st, we received, I believe it was 157 reports of bias. And that's only the reports that came to our office, and that's in less than a 4-month period. To give some context to that, in 2022, the entire year, we received 152 complaints. So that's how, it's a 336% jump. So their words, their language, their narratives have had very direct impact on our community. And again, this number, the 157 reports, those are only the reports that were brought to our office. A lot of them go unreported because people are afraid of retaliation. So that's only the number that we got. So again, we're seeing a very direct impact, and our work at CARE is to try to lessen that impact, right? We're trying to put an alternative narrative out there, right? Our narrative, our stories, our people, right? We want us to, our people to be quoted, right? It's not just, we can't just listen to the IDF as a source, or we can't just listen to the police as like the only source, or the FBI that comes in and traps and surveils and targets our communities, right? They can't be the only source on our community. We have to put our voices out there. That's what we try to do at CARE.
I know I, for one, am thankful for the work that CARE does, and I believe I speak for everyone in the room.
Josie,
I wanted to ask you, how do factors like ethnicity, gender, and culture intersect with your identity, and how does this influence your work?
You're going to think I'm mean. It's a very American and neoliberal question. So I think about anti-colonialism. I think about anti-capitalism in my work. I know that as a Black woman and Caribbean and immigrant, with a funny accent and a Marxist worldview, that's a challenge. And so, I mean, in America, there's insistence on how do you think of gender, how do you think of these things. I'd like us to think about anti-capitalism first, and I'd like us to think about anti-colonial experiences first. Because it is in white supremacy that allows us to think critically about gender, about race, and about all of these issues. And to not allow them to become sort of identity political constructs, but rather to be part of a larger discussion that allows us all into it, that gets us to address sort of historical implications of why we are engaged in the conversation we're engaged in. Because today we're talking mainly about the war in occupied Palestine, but there's a war in Congo, there's a war, there's all these wars, right? So war is very much central to our existence. And women are being affected in those wars of those countries, in Gaza, in West Bank, in Congo, and in other countries. So for me, I have to show up as I am. What's really critical about how I show up is my particular worldview, right? So I could focus on a neoliberal framework about gender identity, but I prefer to place before it or to rest it in sort of an anti-colonial framework.
I think we'll take it back to Amir. Amir, in your opinion, how can the media play a role in fostering a better understanding and tolerance amongst diverse communities, including non-Muslim audiences?
I think a lot of mainstream media and legacy media came a very, very long way so far. For me, when I see mainstream media cover a story that has failed a certain community, because again, it's not just Gaza, right? Like during Black Lives Matter as well, we saw like a lot of headlines that really affected like Black Americans. We saw like headlines that disproportionately were reporting on like the Asian community that led to like, a lot of hate crimes, and just recently in October, like the headlines that were created by mainstream outlets like led lunatics and like a national terrorism crisis that killed like a 7-year-old in Chicago, like stabbed 26 times, right? Because the landlord heard like a headline that like Palestinians or X, Y, and Z. So mainstream media has gone a long way to go, but also it did come like a long way from like how it was previously. A number one tip that I would always recommend any news outlet or media publication is to hire more diverse voices, and I feel like that goes without being said across the board for like not even just like media outlets, but like for every existing organization. There's a lot of like young and aspiring journalists in the Muslim community and that are entering the journalism space. It might be tiring and exhausting because especially like for me, like every time that I work for like a media outlet or publication, they're like, oh, he's Muslim, oh, he's Palestinian, oh, he's Arab, and I get pigeonholed into like stories and cases and coverage that is like particular for my community, but at the same time, it's like if I'm not the one that's spearheading that, then it can like lead to like a lot of misinformation and inaccuracies. So for also just for anybody who feels kind of like powerless when they see like headlines that affect their communities, I would you see it on the tube, like on the subway. If you see something, say something. And I think that in our last panel, Reza did a really good job like saying it as well. But like a lot of editors read their emails, right? So like if you see like misinformation being published online, if you're seeing that like stories are being inaccurate, if you're seeing a lot of inaccurate bias reporting, you send an email. You see something, say something. And one thing that like Muslim has been doing behind the scenes is we recently have been doing a lot of consulting work to newsrooms on how to effectively cover Muslims in media. And we've done this way before October 7th last year. So we worked with like Vox, with a V, not but we worked with them into creating a style guide on how to effectively cover Muslims in media, right? Even when it's appropriate to use a word like terrorism or something that's like differentiate that to us, to the Muslim community, is like obvious, like the difference between like a niqab and hijab. So we put together this extensive guide, so then all the reporters, when it comes, it acts as a resource. So anytime that there's a news story that involves the Muslim community, they have a style guide and style sheet. And to me, that really opened up my eyes that like not just Vox can benefit from this, but a lot of mainstream news organizations and publications can benefit from a style guide and access to a resource like this. So Muslims behind the scenes have been implementing this and trying to get more newsrooms involved on trying to educate them on how to have effective coverage. But there's a lot to say. Like if you see the bias, like you can even reach out to the editors and saying like you guys need to have more Muslims consulting or involved and how that coverage is affecting their publication. So you guys have a lot of power in what you read as a reader.
Yeah, speaking of the effects of coverage, for Dina, you were talking about how there's like a sharp increase of reports of Islamophobic incidents, and people are coming and reporting not to care. Obviously, the media had a role to play. What lessons do you think we can learn from what happened since October the 7th, from the way that media covered it, and what do you think we as Muslims can do to help avoid this kind of negative attention or negative coverage in the future?
So I think just to kind of highlight a point that Amy just brought up, but word choices are really important. Words do matter, and the words that you use, even in your conversations, right? Those words do matter. So, for example, we've seen a lot of coverage of, all the headlines say, and I'm not coming at reporters for this, I know that you guys don't write your headlines, but newsrooms write these headlines, they do it for SEO, they do it for a whole different purpose, like a whole slew of purposes, and that's what really guides their headlines. But we've seen Israel-Hamas war, which implies that there's some sort of equilibrium between these two, between an armed group, arguably a civilian group, right, and a world-class military that receives billions of dollars in funding from the UK, from the US, and other countries as well. So it's implying this sort of false equilibrium. So it's something that we should be worried of when we're reading these sources and also when we're speaking about what's happening in Gaza. There are, the ISCJ right now is trying Israel for war crimes, right? So we also have to, we have to see, okay, this is a genocide that's going on. It's not a war. We have to use these words when we speak, right? So we have, we have to be more conscious of the words that we use, the way that we frame this issue, the way that we frame other issues as well, not just Palestine and Gaza, just on a larger scale. And we do see there is, so I know that sometimes we feel very disheartened by all what we see. We're seeing a lot of, the genocide's still going on, right? We're now over 105 days into the war on Gaza, and it's still going on. It hasn't, people in Gaza they're not reporting that it's getting better, they're actually saying it's getting worse, right? And then we're also seeing a starvation campaign. Israel is starving Gaza. They're also forcibly displacing people in Gaza, right? So it's not getting any better, and then seeing that, and also seeing the headlines and how they're looking at how things are turning out for us, it can be very discouraging. But to point out, the needle is moving very slowly, but it's moving, and that's something we always have to keep in mind, both as Muslims, but also generally in your work that you're doing. In 2006, during Israel's war on Gaza at that time, only 13% of the American public were sympathetic to Palestinians. It was only 13%. Right now in October, so immediately after Israel began its campaign against Gaza, a CBS News poll showed that 54% of Americans were at least sympathetic to Gaza. They weren't supporting Hamas, they weren't supporting armed resistance, they weren't doing any of that, but they were at least sympathetic towards Gaza. And that's a shift, right? It's not our end goal. It's not, even we talk about this a lot when we say ceasefire, but even a ceasefire is not the end goal, right? That's just something that's temporary, right? The end goal is the end of Israel's occupation and the end of apartheid. But again, the needle is shifting, it's moving a little, slightly. It's not where we need it to be, but it's getting there, and it will eventually get there. And as Muslims, we do need to believe that one, Allah's on our side, and two, this is our job as Muslims to speak truth to power, and three, that we, even especially as Muslims, we should know this more than anybody else. We don't get instant gratification, right? We do what we need to do, and we have to wait for the results. And that's part of what we're doing right now, is we're doing what you need to do as Muslims, as advocates for Palestine, and you need to wait for the results.
I'm gonna take it back to Josie.
I promise you kind
I was gonna say, okay, throughout your career, you've been very passionate about advocating for diversity and inclusion. Was there ever a time you faced pushback for standing up for these values?
I think you're adoring me. So again, it's only in America we have these questions on DEI, right? Right, exactly. So, so I come to journalism, I come to this work as an activist and as an academic researcher. And I come to Public Square to sort of address a lot of what you're both talking about and what the journalists in the early come about. Attempting to sort of engage in social transformation. So there is a struggle against information. There's a war on the cooptation. I know Chomsky talks about this in depth. The cooptation of our minds and how we think about the world, and how we make decisions, how we digest, how we show up to be consumed. Public Square is designed to sort of look at those issues on a very local level, because we think, local newsrooms are powerhouses. So in our newsroom, we don't use also the term diverse voices, right? Because we think white people are part of the diversity. We think they have a voice, and so they're part of it. We are addressing the marginalization of those that have been deliberately isolated, socially dislocated, and politically disenfranchised. So those are the voices that we want to show. And language is important for us. We run a community journalism class. At the center of it is media literacy. How do you understand language? How do you use language? I read all of our stories. I read every single word. And I'm very careful about the words we use, the ways sentences are constructed, the descriptions we use, the images we use, the kinds of stories we write, and also we do not create headlines for SEO. You should see our headlines, they're sometimes sentences. Take a look. My work in the past comes into this space because those voices of those who are immigrants are not showing up. I mean, I was an immigrant. I came here, and back then they called them illegal, called us illegal. Came here to this country really to address sort of the sort of divestment of my own island. So when we write our stories, when we think about our stories, what I'm thinking about is who's not being heard, which is why you have Palestinian voices in our newsroom. Why we have one of our leading reporters who is Muslim just won two top prizes for climate change and for health and environmental racism. We have Jewish voices, writers in our newsroom. We have many African countries and Caribbean countries that show up. So for me, it's, am I doing what I believe in? And so am I addressing journalism as part of an anti-colonial struggle? And so it's not about DEI for me, it's rather, am I addressing it for an anti-colonial struggle? I mean, if you Google me, you'll see that I was fired for racism at WBGO. So I led an organizing effort within the institution to address the ways in which non-white people were being treated, were being paid, access to power and position. And it's not the first place that I've done it. So for me, it's that's a critical piece. Am I expanding the space? Am I changing the language? And I think journalism is, as I said earlier, because it's rooted, especially in New Jersey, rooted in white supremacy, it is a space that we must decolonize, and it's a space that we must use to our advantage to decolonize ways in which we talk about stories and talk to each other about who we are.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd bring up that example. I did Google you, and I found that I thought it was really interesting, just how brave you were, to speak truthfully and to bring up the actual issues you found in the company, and just to find that you were let go one day later. I think it's very
Never say let go.
It's
really important. Really important. Claudine Day was fired.
Yeah.
Right? People are fired. They're not, we think about shift, restructuring, fired.
Yeah.
It's a term of capitalism. It's a way in which you control workers. And if we do not own that term, we've given that power.
Yeah. But no, it's okay. It's okay. It's a fair correction. Yeah. It was a shocking story. But I knew you'd own it. And I think it's very inspiring for us Muslims because at this time, a lot of us are really nervous to talk about the conflict in newsrooms. I was at an interview where I was asked specifically about conflict by somebody at NBC, and I was a little too honest, I think.
Yeah, you earn less. You become socially dislocated.
Yeah.
Yeah, and economically.
Yeah. So it's inspiring to see, others are standing up for truth to power. Okay, moving on back to some general questions. The past few months have shown us that one subject could be covered drastically differently depending on the viewpoint of the journalist. From misinformation to personal bias to perpetuating Islamophobic narratives, what lessons have you learned specifically from recent news coverage, and how can the media implement those lessons in the future?
I think, again, my sort of a critical piece about lexicon and sound bites, right? there's a history, and I think that really it's the reporters and citizens who play a role in ways in which media changes. Right? So, and also there's a distinction that we haven't really addressed today, which is there's a difference between media and press. The press is covered under the First Amendment. It is so that the freedom of information and the right of citizens to understand what's happening in their government, in their society. So I think these issues around how people are curated and consumed is it's really up to all of us. So you've got to support independent news organizations over media conglomerates. You have to support sort of journalists who are working within press institutions. So language and ideas and the ways in which we're creating for consumption only changes if citizens change and if citizens demand a change. We face it. We face it as Caribbean people. Mainly, Haitians have been ostracized, particularly in America. We face it as Africans from varying countries. The ways in which we show up and we're described and we're consumed and how we interpret it, and that becomes part of a narrative of stereotyping. How do we, and that's a whole bit about how do we decolonize journalism and demand that journalism sort of transforms itself, because we're the consumers. And I often call social media the red light district. We all probably know what the red light district is. So another piece is that we have to unpack the role of citizen journalism and press, and what role they play. I mean, journalism is changing, and it changed because of Black Lives Matter. Like that, it changed because of Black Panther Party. It changed because of the abolition movement before that. So journalism is constantly changing. We have to hold on to those changes and engage in social transformation, and so address the stereotyping and demand that changes. And so that is about, I think you said it right. It's the language you choose to repeat, the language you choose to write. It is the stories you share. It's your role in supporting local journalists, your role in supporting local media, because as my fellow publisher said, for us, we exist to amplify local voices in global spaces. So issues that affect us on the ground are really issues that we think about and understand from a global context. And so how do we sort of bring them to them? So I think that's a key piece.
I think also something that recent months have shown us with media specifically is that it's not enough to just have people of color in the newsroom, because we've seen Don Lemon's coverage of Gaza. We've seen some very well-known reporters who are Muslim and have very Muslim sounding names and have built their identity and their platform based on them being Muslim. And we've seen their coverage of the war on Gaza, and sometimes it's been great, and other times it's been very disappointing. And then Lita, you just mentioned that you were in an interview with MSNBC, and they probably did not like your answer about the war on Gaza. Well, they also did just cancel the show. They canceled, right word, canceled Mehdi Hassan's show, but essentially they were firing him, right? They fired him. And then he said, I'm leaving, so again, his words, I'm leaving, I'm not saying. So it's a bunch of like very important words. But again, like these are people of color, these are Muslims, these are folks who know exactly what's happening in Gaza, and sometimes it's not just enough to have a Muslim in a newsroom or a person of color in a newsroom. And this goes back to also DEI, right? It's not enough to have like your newsroom bringing in a facilitator to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and talk about how we can make this newsroom more welcoming, more inclusive, more this, more that. And yet all of the reporters in the newsroom are Harvard graduates, right? Whose parents probably paid for their degree, who are legacy students, or who are legacy journalists. Also, their dad is a journalist and their grandpa's a journalist, and it goes on and on and on. So it's not enough to just have a Muslim or a brown person or a black person in the media space. We need to go beyond that. And that's not just for media, that's also in government, when we're electing people into office, right? It's not enough that somebody comes into the masjid and says, I'm a Muslim, vote for me. You're Muslim, great, but what is your platform? What are you doing? And that's, I think, the war in Gaza right now, that especially has been very transformative. Hopefully it is very transformative for us as a community, and it's teaching us that you don't just flock towards the Muslims, you don't just flock towards people of color, you don't just flock towards the black person in the newsroom or the black person in office, right? It's like, okay, you're black, great, but what did you do for your community? What did you do for our community? What are you going to do for our community, right? It's not enough for them to just have that identity, because sometimes it's really just emptiness. And that builds a disappointment, right? So it's like, you really need to be more than just your identity. You have to go beyond that. You have to, if you want to be Muslim in an office, okay, be a Muslim and act like a Muslim. And what does acting like a Muslim mean? It's not just to wear hijab and to have a beard. It's also to, speak, with the war in Gaza right now, the war on Gaza right now, right? You need to go speak up about that. You need to go support your sisters and brothers. You need to go support people who are oppressed. That's part of our religion, right? So it's not just enough to be Muslim. It's not just enough to be brown or black or whatever marginalized group you are. So that was one thing that we learned from this. There's one, but I'll let you take it.
One thing that I witnessed while we have experienced all these like biased news coverage the last few months is how we're seeing this shift in building and flocking towards independent reporting and media outlets, right? When the New York Times has failed us continuously, and I don't know if anyone else had seen it, but during that time, like especially like October, November, every single time there's a new post on the New York Times on Instagram, I was physically like taking the phone and bashing it in my head because I was just like, I can't believe they're covering this story in this way. They're not including any type of like, it was awful. But when we saw coverage like this, what was beautiful to see is how the community flocked to independent platforms like Eye on Palestine, for instance, which is like a very pivotal hub for eyewitness accounts of what's going on in Gaza and in the West Bank, and they even go across that as well, and they cover, they receive videos from, it's as if we're all correspondents, right? They receive videos from like London, the US, marches, right? It kind of became a pivotal independent platform that we built up and we put our trust into. And it just reminds me of how like Muslims started, because when Muslims started, it started out of necessity. It started because we were consistently neglected. And that's like one thing about the bias, right? Like I will always cover a story on how this affects the Muslim community. And that's the bias of like our publication, but it's because that is what is neglected and not seen in mainstream media. That's not to go to say that like all biases are negative and bad. No, like how Trump's presidency affected the Muslim community is something that is like, not talked about, but our platform will cover in that lens, right? Similar to like how what is happening right now is affecting the Muslim community, and so on. So we need to continue to build and to support platforms that have underrepresented voices, that are independent, that are new. And like what you said, like a lot of these independent platforms, like we don't have funding, we don't have investors, we like depend on community support. Just recently, like Muslims does not receive any investor funding, we don't receive like any government tax funding, nothing. Any dollar that is made through like a Snapchat show or a sponsored post or anything like that goes directly back into building our platform. So just recently, we were like, oh my God, October 7th has brought an influx of all this coverage to Palestine. We need to hire a full-time producer for Gaza. And we put it out there on our platform. It's the first time that we asked our platform, like, guys, we need help because like now it's getting really serious. We need full-time reporters just to cover out Gaza. And then come to that, it came through where we saw a lot of support from our community that's like, yes, we need to have a reporter full-time focusing on Gaza. So we were seeing like, so we're able to implement like a full-time reporter to have that continued coverage and like have all this help and disseminate all that information and publish consistently on Gaza. But if it the people were, that disbelieved and, have this trust with like legacy media and fought the independent, media platforms, we wouldn't be able to provide and have a service like that that's able to push stories of Gazans on the ground. Our platform serves a purpose. Like we collaborate close all the time with Bassam, with Bilal, and right now Anas, who's in Khan Yunis, that is consistently being bombarded every single day. And so it's a lot. So again, moral of the story is if you see something wrong with mainstream media outlets, please look into independent reporting and independent platforms, whether that's Iran Palestine, whether that's Muslim, even like Middle East Eye and all these like, amazing platforms that would flourish during this time as well because of their continued coverage on Gaza that's been really effective. So.
But also on that with the independent reporting, you'll notice, even for yourselves, it's not just to support these independent platforms, but you'll also see like with a lot of non-independent or a lot of bigger corporate platforms with New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, all these other platforms, their news is also not as accurate, right? That's something to always keep in mind also. So you're not just doing a favor to independent platforms. No, you're getting, this is for yourself first and foremost, because they'll talk about, let's say, for example, anti-Semitism, and they'll say there was an incident of anti-Semitism at this synagogue, and then you go and you ask, okay, what was the anti-Semitism? Or a student faced an act of anti-Semitism at his school. What was the anti-Semitism? Somebody walked by the Palestinian flag. That's not anti-Semitism, right? So you need to also, the independent platforms, you're not just supporting them as a favor, but also because their work is important, their work is good work, right? And then also on the flip side, you have also reporters who are not working with independent platforms, and we're doing it for whatever reasons. Maybe it's the resources, maybe it's like, it's just whatever reason they're doing it. But also support them and their work, the reporters whose work you respect, the reporters who have honest and good work. Circulate their stories, because at the end of each month, at least with other newsrooms that I've been in, at the end of each month, we'd have an editorial meeting, and editors would look at the highest performing stories. If a story performs well or has high performance, if it's circulated, if it gets a lot of clicks, if it gets a lot of views, and that helps. That also helps guide the newsroom strategy. So when you see a good story, circulate that, send it to your friends, tell them, hey, watch this video, watch this story, share this to your Instagram, share it to your social media. Put it on those WhatsApp groups, all the WhatsApp groups, share it, put it there, right? Make sure you're amplifying their work so they get those clicks so they can continue doing that sort of work. Because at the end of the day, with these newsrooms, a lot of it is just business, whatever brings in money. So if you're getting them clicks, they're bringing in money, and you're helping them, and you're going to continue to amplify their work and the important stories that they're covering.
Sure. I'm like beating it at last, right? So I'm so anti that. So listen, stories get repeated because of money. Right? It's about power and positioning. It's about access. So we can't be driven by the dominant narrative, and not just the dominant narrative, but the dominant news item of the day. Right? So if you're really interested in investing in your community and your voice, you're obligated to seek those stories out. You're obligated to share them as well and read them and use them. And this is not about the clicks. This is not, and so I show up to funders, I'm like, how many clicks? And I say, I'm sorry, I don't do clicks, I do news. I don't do clicks and I don't do search engines. I'm trying to find the stories that are unheard. I'm trying to find the invisible voices. I'm trying to find the quiet spaces in our community where people are lost. So our stories are that. And our stories take time to do that. So I appreciate that piece, but we've got to consider, if we're going to address the colonial structure of journalism, we've got to figure out ways that we're building our newsrooms and building independent journalism and expanding the spaces for storytelling in different ways. And that is about how we're building coalitions. So I'm a Black newsroom, but I'm telling the Palestinian story and Muslim story. I'm a Black newsroom, but I'm giving space to my Jewish journalists, and I'm demanding that you respond because I've given space to Palestinians, you have to respond. I'm giving space to white people, but in my space, we've got to see whiteness as a tool of white supremacy. So we've got to figure out how we're doing journalism differently. And so that's, it's the power of the word, the power of the narrative, but it's also our power. Because, journalism is just codified as short time ago. And so we have these conversations about journalists, and it's all like, did you go to journalism school? Right? So I was in a meeting on reparative journalism, and they were talking about journalism schools and journalists coming out of journalism schools, and I said, none of our community reporters have gone to journalism school, but they're winning awards. None of our journalists have gone to journalism school, but they're writing stories about their community, and our obligation is to provide them the highest quality of journalism. So we've got to just do more of that.
Ask you guys one last question. Any advice for young aspiring journalists? What are some things that you went through in the beginning, or lessons you've learned that you want to give to people who want to follow the pursuits and field that you do?
Again, I'm not a journalist. I'm a publisher, but I also write and take pictures. You have to be bold and courageous and push your way into spaces that are white dominated. I have to do that. We're a small newsroom. I'm one of 12 Black publishers in New Jersey, and our combined budget can't hit $500,000. 12 Black publishers in New Jersey, and our combined budgets can't hit. You and I got $100,000 recently, so we're like high rollers. I'm like a high roller. You're one, right? Maybe how many covering the Muslim community in New Jersey? Right? You're covering. No, it's an entity. Right. So the lesson I've learned in the short space is I've got to develop young people to be bold and claim power in the spaces that I put them in. That's my obligation. To get them to think differently, and so we do a lot of media literacy, right, about writing their stories. So we have a community journalism class, which I encourage everyone to apply for. We did a pilot last year. We're going to expand it this year. We're grounding it in emancipatory journalism. What does that mean? We want to tell better stories from the bottom up. We want to make sure that we're contextualizing it historically, and we want our journalists to be part of movement building. If you're not part of movement building, you're not part of the anti-colonial struggle, and so you're not using journalism in the way in which it should be used, which is to deconstruct power, and which is to bring power back to the community.
I would say that wherever you go, in terms of newsrooms, find your allies. So find somebody who you know is going to have your back. Find somebody, probably senior staff. That's probably the best. Find somebody who's going to advocate for you, because sometimes these newsrooms can be very cutthroat. And if you don't have somebody who's senior staff who kind of has your back, who's there to hear you vent when you, who's there to, maybe if you want to start a union in your newsroom. Newsrooms are like notorious for unionizing because the workplace violence is just terrible. But if you're starting a union, make sure that before you take that step that you have people in your corner. And I think that's where I learned a lot in my first job at the Intercept, was making sure that I had people in my corner, and that made the experience all the much, like that's what made my experience at the Intercept. Moved on to Al Jazeera, you still actually, even at Al Jazeera, I was great, but you still have, even in a place like Al Jazeera where the majority of your coworkers are people of color, but again, it's not enough to just be a person of color. But even in places like that, you have to go and you have to find your ally. Find somebody who's affirming of you, or some people who are affirming of you, of your identity, of what you need to do, what you do as a Muslim, what your values are. Find that and stick to that, and just move your way around through that.
Yeah, so glad that you shared that. Before I launched Muslim, I had a lot of different newsroom experience as an intern. And oftentimes I found myself always being the only Muslim, the only Arab in that room space. And I was even doing journalism for like, do you guys remember TV Guide magazine? Like, yeah, I can't believe this, but I was an intern for I was an intern for them. And oftentimes when like there's something that is like, racially different, right? So the editors would get passed on to me, little me, right? And I have nothing to do with like Syria, right? But then it's like, oh man, this new movie called is about a spy in Syria that would help the US. And I'm like, for real? Like, anyway. I say this because if you are an aspiring Muslim journalist, if you're an aspiring journalist who comes from a background, like expect that like when you're in a newsroom that you don't see a lot of allies or a lot of people that's on your team, that you're going to be passed off stories or you're going to be, sent things that you're like, what the hell? There's some power to it, right? Because then you get to control narratives here, but at the same time, it's an expectation that you have to understand that, from clearly just don't find yourself being pigeonholed into doing this type of stuff, and to always hold editors accountable, hold people in positions of power accountable for any type of work that makes you feel uncomfortable, because at the end of the day, like, what you say can provide change for not just you, but for the next person as well that comes along into this space. And for, if anyone in here is Muslim and an aspiring journalist, for me it's different because, I launched Muslim while I was a junior in university. I became very tunnel visioned into building Muslim. So I kind of just, especially after I graduated, it was just Muslim full time. For me, I lead very, I set my intentions, and I think that's what every journalist who is Muslim, if you are going to focus on the Muslim community, if you have the intention to focus on the community, it's very important to set that in the work and the intentions that you do. So every single time I pray during sujood, I have the same 3 du'as I've been doing for the past 4 years. Muslims about to turn, mashallah, 5 years in February 16th. I'll share with you the du'as that I make when I'm in sujood, and the first one is, Ya Allah, please guide me to the right path that you see that is best fit for me. That's most important. Number 2, Ya Allah, allow my intentions to be pure, right? It's so easy, especially if you're doing work for the community, you start getting opportunities coming your way, especially if you're in a mainstream space. And it's so important for you to like lead by your ethics and morals. For Muslim, we were invited twice the past 2 years to go to the White House for the Eid Star, and we rejected it both times. And by doing so, it cost us, relationships. It cost us access to these spaces, to individuals that might harm us in the long run. But I don't want to give any administration any sort of approval that we co-sign by having us attending any type of event of some sort, right? Number 3, the dua that I make during sujood is, Ya Allah, provide for me as you provide for the birds. I see how he provides for the birds in Mecca and Medina, so Ya Allah, please provide for me as you provide for them. This work is really taxing, harrowing, like, you feel alone, especially if you're doing independent media work. Like, just recently, mashallah, we just got grant funding, and that was just like, oh my God, we're finally able to have full-time staffers. We've been doing this for almost 5 years now. But I just have trust in Allah. There are times where I couldn't even, we have a huge, mashallah, listserv and emailing list that every Friday we send out the latest news of what happens in the Muslim community after Jummah. There's times where I couldn't even pay the dang MailChimp the subscription fee, right? But then something just comes. That's like, alhamdulillah, I'm able to be provided for so I can continue serving my mission and, the platform. So when you have this, confidence in your work and Allah that you're not doing this for any type of opportunism, to tokenize yourself, to kind of be center field here, Just focus on the community. Your work will blossom and it'll shine through. So if you're doing this for the intention to help your community, to serve a purpose, it's really, really important that you lay the groundwork for, I call it an internal constitution, right? For how I run Muslim. So it's really important that you set that, because it's going to be a long, difficult, pesky road ahead of you when you go to a path to serve a community. At times, even like your community might not be grateful for it, right? Like at times your community is gonna be like, oh, you supposed to not do that, why you supposed to do that? I'm like, I'm a one-man team here, right? So at times you're gonna be facing that, but you take a deep breath and you're like, okay, like, I'm going back to my constitution. I'm not doing it for this. I'm doing it for the greater picture here to serve my community. So that's what I have to share.
Alright, I'm gonna open it up to the audience. Does anybody have any questions for our lovely panelists? Oh, go ahead.
And be more specific about methodologies for decolonial journalism or reporting.
Yeah, so there's a professor Shaw, I believe he's at the University of Illinois. And I stumbled on him recently. And prior to that, the idea of language being important in the information we share, and being Caribbean, so I grew up on the staples of Rodney and Cabral, and so many others. But I can't remember right now. They were all journalists, right? They were all writing about revolution and writing about ways in which communities who are disenfranchised and marginalized by government policy, and not just local government policy, but the global marketplace. So how were they getting the information to make a difference in their lives? So I was inspired by all of that, because and it's the reason the work with rural agricultural women is so important, right? They haven't graduated from elementary school, but they're engaged in work and engaged in movement building, engaged in changing policy that affects price points. So narratives are important to that, storytelling is important to that, how we show up in those spaces, how we negotiate power. And so ideas and stories give us the leverage to negotiate in spaces that we don't have power to put in power. Professor Shah sort of designed something, and this goes back to the 90s, on emancipatory journalism. So I was talking about liberatory journalism, and I stumbled on him through John Ball at Black Dot Media, who talked a lot about emancipatory journalism and giving me a structure to think about it. So we want, if we're going to bring community reporters into our space, then it takes time to train them. Language, stories, how to select stories, how to select choices, all of that matters. The way in which you sort of frame stories in an ideological construct. How do you understand power? And how do you leverage that in your story? In very simple ways, not in an academic way. Because if you have we have a 15-year-old who writes for us, we have a 17-year-old who writes for us, we have undergrads who write for us. So it's really important to spend time with them. That's work, that's labor, but it's intentional. And I'm committed to that intentionality because I want to have different kinds of conversations. I want to see different kinds of stories in very simple ways. So if you read our stories, you'll see that. So the training matters, the editorial process matters. How we engage our reporters in movement building is critical. So behind you, you'll see members of People's Organization for Progress. I usually buy memberships for the reporters to participate in people's organization for progress. It's really hard for young people to show up in movement building. Sometimes they don't show up to the meetings, but I make a point that part of the training process for journalism and public service is that they go to protests, they go